We've talked about the multicultural U.S. and how we have many cultures coming in from other countries and within the U.S. and creating different perspectives and values within and between communities. Now we have to talk about the multilingual U.S. So with those different cultures, we may be bringing in different languages, and we can have primary or secondary languages. Because the U.S. doesn't have an official language as other countries do, they can continue to use those languages and learn English as it necessitates. Now, that doesn't mean that as speech pathologists we have to require that the clients learn English, and it also doesn't require that we learn their language, but it does mean that we have to meet somewhere in the middle. So we'll talk about the multilingual U.S. in terms of what the differences are and how that can affect the ability to communicate and provide services for these individuals. So when we're talking about primary and secondary languages, in the unilingual and bilingual, we have to have the understanding that some people may come into the U.S. with already established bilingualism or multilingualism, where they are already speaking multiple languages, whether or not English is one of them. We also have to understand that they may not necessarily be willing or accepting of becoming bilingual or multilingual, and have the understanding that becoming bilingual is very challenging as you're learning the underlying language system of that new language, and you are better able to learn a second language if you have the immersion into that community and the meaning that's associated, just like when you learn your first language. So for unilingual, that is someone who speaks only one language. And when we're talking about these levels of unilingual and bilingual, I want you to keep in mind that this is a fluent speaker of these languages. This isn't somebody who has taken a class and learned the nouns and the verbs and can say a few sentences. This is someone who can go out and have a conversation and go into the community, whether it is at 80% or 90%, but it's definitely not at the 20-30% level. So the bilingual speaks 2 languages, and multilingual or polyglot speak more than 2 languages. The multiculturalism and the multilingualism go together in the U.S., but again it goes back to just because someone is from a different culture does not mean that they have a different language, and that just because someone is from a particular culture, they speak the same language as other individuals within that language. And then we have to think about language minorities, and this is not a minority where there is a disadvantage. It just means that they're a comparatively smaller group within the U.S., and that is the Spanish speakers, the Asian speakers, and the Native American languages. We don't have a lot of availability or access to resources in the U.S. public schools for these language groups, and so that means that they're already at a disadvantage if they're coming in as speakers of these languages, and we're going to provide services to them because we have to have an understanding of their language as they have to have one with ours. Now, as these individuals become fluent or are working on their fluency in English, we can break it down into dialect and accent. And dialect and accent doesn't have to refer to only the bilinguals or multilinguals. It can also be the unilinguals. So when we talk about individuals from different areas of Louisiana, we have different dialects. Or as they're going from one language to another language, they have different accents. So a dialect is just a variation in a specific language, and it does have the context of the language domains of phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. They're going to have those differences based on the dialects. So dialects are rule-based. In terms of dialects, you can change your dialect or shift your dialect depending on the way that you are communicating or who you're communicating with. So to define that, we have code switching, which is shifting the language during the same conversational episode. So going from talking to your best friend to your instructor are going to be different types of use of that language, and you can do the same thing with dialect. So African American English to Standard American English. The context of the use of those dialects can vary. There's also language mixing, where you're involving words from 2 languages in a single sentence, or you're creating different sentences spoken in different languages but by the same speaker. And this is again influenced by that topic, the listener, or the context. And so that can be someone who typically speaks Spanish trying to communicate in English and using words in the Spanish context or the Spanish language because they either don't know the words, they can't find the words, or they have just the use of that word in that moment. Accent, on the other hand, is the speech sound production and differences in the rhythms of speech. So to have a dialect, you can have an accent, but to have an accent does not necessitate that you have a dialect. In the U.S., we have 10 major dialects based on geographic regions, and it can change the way that certain vowels are produced, the ways that consonants are produced, and the words that we use. So, for instance, in some regions you can say caught versus cat. This is the same thing as car and caw. We have consonantal differences like farmer or fama. And then word usage like soda or Coke. My grandpa's from Washington, and he says sody pop. It can also vary on socioeconomic situation or speaking situation and subgroups of users of a dialect. So for the socioeconomic group, we're looking at the social class, the education, the occupation, and the income level, as well as race and ethnicity. So I gave you an example back in the language, acquired language lecture of my mom, who is a chef, and my friend, who is a psychology professor. They have different word uses, and so using different dialects can reflect that as well. If you're in a particular social class, you might not be driven to modify your dialect or learn a new dialect based on who you're using it with in the context. For the speaking situation, it really depends on the topic and the relationship between the speaker and the listener. For instance, you learned previously about acquiring language or developmental language and the use of motherese between an infant and a child. It can also be going from formal to informal use of language, where there are words that you would say in a football game that you wouldn't say at church. It can also be between a teacher and a friend, or a woman who is talking at a job interview versus to her husband versus her best friend. And then there are subgroups of dialects like teens who come up with these wonderful new words all the time, and it can vary by gender. And you can see that some of our language is growing even more recently in terms of gender to include more individuals. So when we're looking at this, where accent fits in, the change in the production of the vowels and the consonants is the accent, but it does not necessitate a dialect. So one of the dialects we'll talk about is African American English, and it is just a product of cultural, social, and historical forces. So African American English, just by its first interpretation of it, you may say that it is different from or changes to Standard American English. And essentially what we've tried to do moving forward in speech pathology and as a communication society as a whole is stop that comparison and understand that it is a dialect and it has its own rules and it has its own system, and it is not a degenerate form of African American or Standard American English. It is its own dialect. It is a native English dialect that's prevalent among African Americans, but other races can use that. So it's become known as the African American English, but it doesn't rely on individuals who are African American to use this type of dialect. When we talk about the African American English, we have to understand, as we go back to the comparison between Standard American English and African American English, that we do not associate the intellectual ability of somebody with an African American English dialect, just as we wouldn't with a Southern dialect or a Northwestern dialect. They all have different words. They all have different underlying language domains and systems. And it has absolutely nothing to go back with the person's intellectual abilities. For accent, we have more of the bilingual speakers. So this is where the rules or the phonological rules carry over from the first language into the second language. And it depends on how the language is learned. So there's simultaneous language learning, which means that you're learning your first and your second language at the same time. Or you have sequential language learning, where you're learning a first language and then later on you learn a second language. So simultaneous learning would be, you have a mom who is from the Philippines and a father who is American, and your mother will speak in her language and your father will speak in his language, and you're learning them both at the same time. Sequential language learning can be that you grew up in the Philippines learning that language, you come to America, and you have to now learn English. So accents can result in particular speech characteristics or grammatical features. It can also change the syntax, and there can be mispronunciations or inappropriate word use. But it's just that carryover of that first language into that second language. For the secondary English dialects, this is a variation of any form of English that's influenced by the speaker's primary language. So in the Hispanic or Latinx cultures, we assume that they all speak Spanish, but there are varying dialects of Spanish. And the use of the Spanish rules can change depending on those situations. So that's my example of the patient that came to the ER, and we tried to use our standard Spanish-speaking interpreter, but we weren't able to because the dialect was different. Those rules can carry over into their English use as they learn English as a second language. And again, it goes back to, it doesn't change the intelligence of that person, it's just the influence of the underlying rules of language. In the Asian cultures, we have to think about how many different languages are just within Asia. So India alone has 15 major languages and 180 languages that are spoken and 700 dialects. And that's just in India. We still have to think about Pakistan and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, China, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, Japan. All of it has its own diverse language types and diverse dialects, and how that can influence the use of English as a dialect, as well as their accent.